Timeless is changing once again. For better or worse? Well, let's talk about it. So, if you aren't aware, in Edge of Eternities, which is the next upcoming set coming out in July 29th, I believe, there is a bonus sheet on top of the special guest set. So, we're gonna be getting a lot of new cards, and this particular bonus sheet is just full of lands, just like 40 or so lands. Well, amongst these lands, there's some spoiled ones already, and there's some rumored ones that we're going to be talking about, which is going to impact the Timeless format quite a bit. And the supposed rumored card, it's only a rumor, but so far, the person who leaked this has been correct through and through, so we'll just believe that that is the case. So I'll just talk about the rumored ones anyways, because it's a pretty insane one. And as for historic, there is one particular card that I'm going to be talking about, which concerns me greatly. So I'll touch a little bit up on that as well at the end. But first, we're going to be talking about the Timeless. And it's the card that was revealed today, which is this card, Ancient Tomb. So obviously, this is going to impact Timeless quite a bit. But there's a problem. Right, there's a problem. So although it's exciting, let's take a look at what is going on in Timeless at the moment. So for a bit, we had Esper Tempo pushing out all the combo decks out there after fine-tuning the deck to adapt things like Flare of Denial. But with the recent set, not the upcoming set, the show and tell has gotten more powerful as of recent. Getting things like Rakshas's Bargain and even a Carpet of Flowers, which has kind of shifted the balance in favor of a show and tell in this matchup. Before this, Esper Tempo had the edge, but that is not the case anymore because of these two cards. But the Esper Tempo can still win out, depending on the draws, things like that, and how well you play. And with the Ancient Tomb coming, I think this is going to tip the balance even more in favor of a show and tell, I believe. So for example, like on the draw, you're going to see a turn to show and tell even more often, without having to rely on bad cards like Dark Ritual, things like that. But although I say this, but the show and tell deck might, become a completely different deck after Ancient Tomb comes out, because the thing about Ancient Tomb is that it is only generating colorless mana, so, being a 3-color deck, it might be pretty hard to, cast things like Assemble the Team or even Mana Drain, things like that. So it's not all upsides to being able to play the Ancient Tomb. There are some downsides as well. So we'll see how the show and tell adapts this Ancient Tomb into the deck. Because again, I'm not sure if they're going to be able to play double blue spells or, 2-color pip like Assemble the Team with Ancient Tomb, things like that. Although it's really good for rushing out the show and tell, but you could also miss out on tempo if you don't have show and tell combo. You're stuck on lands with Ancient Tomb and another land with Assembled Team or Mana Drain. So I could be wrong on that, but I think there's a good chance show and tell decks might become different, or they could even stay the same. On the other hand, Rakshas's Bargain can still stay in the deck because it also plays with colorless, by the way. The first time I casted Rakshas's Bargain on opponent's end step on turn 3, I was like, man, this card is better than Dictor Time. The card is really insane because now they have to either counter the Rakshas's Bargain, but they're not going to because now your turn comes in and can play show and tell if opponent taps out trying to counter Rakshas's Bargain. The fact that you can, play this card on turn 3 is just insane. And not to mention the synergy between this card and you also have Dig Through Time, so it is a pretty insane card. So the fact that this card can also abuse the Ancient Tomb's colorless mana, right, means that you can play this on turn 3 anyways, even though you have an Ancient Tomb, because you can pay one of those pips using the colorless. So let's say if Esper Tempo becomes even weaker, right? Well, there is a problem because now combo decks come out to play, such as Belcher and Oops. To beat a show and tell deck, you have to go even faster, right? And that's what Belcher and Oops spells deck do, right? So if Esper Tempo becomes weaker as a result of Ancient Tomb and, Show and Tell becomes more popular, these other decks that can go even faster, the Belcher decks, in my opinion, has a pretty good matchup into a Show and Tell because it's not very easy for them to just play out Show and Tell because if you get a Belcher down on the battlefield, you can just shoot your opponent in response to opponent casting a card. So, like I said, if Esper Tempo becomes weaker, all the other, combo decks becomes even stronger. As for the other decks that are going to become more powerful are decks that can abuse both the Ancient Tombs and Ugin's Lab to basically accelerate their plays, right? So, we could see some Blood Moon decks coming out. We could see Chalice decks becoming more powerful, and of course, sneak attack decks becoming more powerful. And also, by the way, with the special guest spoiler, we also got Magus of the Moon, although it's a little bit ugly, I would say. It is what it is. We now finally have a Magus of the Moon in Timeless now. So you have a little bit more consistent way of playing, Magus of the Moon or the Blood Moon on turn 2, now that we have 8 copies of Soul Lands. So being able to lock your opponent out from playing the game could become even more of a thing. I'm sure a lot of people are, going to be pretty happy about that or not happy about that. Very black and white when it comes to this. And another deck that could potentially pop out are the Eldrazi's, because another card that has been spoiled so far are the Eldrazi Temples. So the Eldrazi's are going to have Eldrazi Temple, Ancient Tomb, and Ugin's Lab. So you have a total of 12 Soul Lands to play out your stuff really, really fast. So, for example, a turn 2 Thought-Knot Seer is going to become totally viable, which is good for the Eldrazi's because Eldrazi's lacked early game interaction. So being able to do that is really good. And you could even, right, in the sideboard against like a Show and Tell matchups. So not only do you have like a hand disruption that goes through Veil of Summer, but you also have flutes to bring in that you can play on turn 1. Turn 1 flute into turn 2 Thought-Knot Seer could be very deadly against such one Tell. So I think the Eldrazi's might actually be a thing. We'll see. So I think there's going to be a lot of different decks being experimented on with these cards. But, where does that leave something like Energy and Timeless? So Energy is not a thing in older formats, right? Outside of Modern. And unfortunately, I think the Energy, there's a good chance. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there's a good chance that the Energy might get pushed out if we get, more and more of these mana acceleration coming to Timeless. And especially considering that more, you're going to see more Chalice of the Void coming out to fight off against something like Energy. It's going to become very annoying for the Energy players, but fear not, there are some ways you can fight off against Chalice of the Void, and they are things like Wear and Tear, or even Prismatic Ending. Now, for the spicy bit, which is to be rumored. I repeat, this is rumored. However, so far, these rumors have been all true. So I'll, talk about a bit about the supposed rumored card, which is actually this card here called the Stripmine. Now, funny thing is, apparently, Wasteland, which is supposed to be a little bit watered down version of a Stripmine, is speculated to be not in the set, which leaves us with only Stripmine, which is a bit weird. I mean, say goodbye to your lands, I guess. So, there is all this talk about, Stripmine going to get restricted day 1, things like that. But we don't even have any counter spells in the format that are good for older format purposes. So for real though, is it possible that Stripmine does not get restricted day 1, considering that we don't even have Wasteland in the format? Because I feel like, at this point, if we just let the format loose with all these Soul Lands coming out, we're gonna have a very, very one-sided combo-centric format. So if we are going to go full degeneracy, why not let Stripmine be a thing in Timeless as well? This would make, Tempo decks still be a thing in Timeless, even with Ancient Tombs coming for the combo players. And maybe, we'll get this weird format with bunch of Soul Lands and Stripmines without even a single Force of Negation, Daze, or Force of Will, things like that. And yes, I know that this isn't just a Wasteland situation and Stripmine is even more annoying, but I don't know. I feel like you just fight fire with fire at this point. Just let it all burn down. Because like I feel like at this point, the format is so stale. We need a shakeup in the format anyways. This would also make like tricolor decks a little bit worse with their lands get blown away that rely on like double color pips, things like that. And yeah, I think this could be a crazy idea, but to make Tama's format a little bit more fresh, in my opinion, I think you just let it loose with all these broken stuff and potentially restrict it later. Because like I said, without this card, I think the format right now will be kind of the same, except you'll see like show and tell, oops all spells decks, and Belchers dominating the format. So I don't know, just a thought. And interesting thing about the strip mine in every deck, all the decks trying to adapt some strip mines into the deck. I think it'll be a pretty interesting challenge, given that currently like all the show and tell decks, they're playing a lot of like double pip colored cards, right? It might be pretty hard to have like both the ancient tomb and strip mines be incorporated into the deck. It's going to be much harder than you'd expect. For example, like Mystic Sanctuary. How do you play Mystic Sanctuary when you have, 4 Ancient Tombs and 4 Strip Mines? How do you run things like Necropones? And it'll be harder to run things like Mana Drain. So, although if you are playing combo, you want these cards in the deck, there will be times when you have Ancient Tomb or Strip Mine, have no mana for the Mana Drain, or against like aggressive decks, against like energy, they can go under you even though you have like interaction spells stuck in your hand. Or for example, like let's say you have Necropones and then you don't have Dark Ritual, and you have like things like Strip Mine and Ancient Tomb with the Swamp, and you can't cast Necropones. So all things considered, I think it'll be very interesting to see how these decks change from here on. And yeah, if Strip Mine's not restricted, I think it'll be a completely different meta, which is I think a lot of people feel at the moment. They want a fresher format because they love Timeless. As for historic, obviously the Ancient Tomb and Magus are going to get pre-banned, so we don't really talk about those, but there is one card that concerns me, and that is Eldrazi Temple. Is this card going to get pre-banned in historic? I wonder, because Wizard of the Coast stance on historic from the BNR announcement is that verbatim, we limit free spells and land destructions so that players have time and resources to play their cards. So right now, the best decks are Sorin and Eldrazi, and we get that free spells and land destructions are not a thing in historic. But the statement following that here says, so that players have time and resources to play their cards, feels a bit off right now. Eldrazi's are ramping faster than ever thanks to Ugin's Lab, and Sorin into Elenda comes out way too fast for Historic to reliably handle, considering that the interactions in Historic are, well, very bad. Counterspell Unban has been a step in the right direction, right? Spawning a bunch of like tier 2 or 3 decks, but nothing like too crazy, I would say. So the top meta has remained unchanged in my opinion. And if we get Eldrazi Temple, I believe like the entire ladder will be just Eldrazi's and Sorin decks, which is kind of where we're at already. But if you're not like at like the top of the ladder, it's going to be a lot different. Also, like I'm only talking best of 3 at the moment. Best of 1 ladder is completely different, right? Best of 1 ladder is just a lot of shifting would land, combo decks, things like that. So if we get Eldrazi Temple, because we don't have good land destructions to fight off against the Eldrazi at the moment in Historic, which is basically the concept they don't want in Historic, as they've mentioned in BNR, right? So currently in Modern, the best ways to fight Eldrazi's are Consign and Charmal. We currently have Consign, but it does require blue, and blue isn't, very popular in Historic right now. But that might change with the current situation with the Counterspell Unban, and more people are trying out the blue decks. However, the thing is, Eldrazi's don't really care about counterspells, so Consign isn't very good in beating the Eldrazi decks unless you present a very fast clock. So this is why like control decks have a very hard time beating Eldrazi decks, because even though you can use counter spells, they still get the on cast effects. So for example, like Sowing Might spawn into something like Cavern of Souls. Even if you had counter spell against a Sowing Might spawn, they still get the effect. And now they get a Cavern of Souls, which means that all the counter spells stuck in your hand is going to become useless. So a tempo deck comes to mind for these kind of situations, like a tempo, like a blue-red tempo deck. But what's really funny about that is they also have this really, really weird nerf in Historic at the moment, which is the Dragon Ray Channeler and Unholy Heat, both of which could be pretty nice right now because Red has a very hard time removing stuff. Like Unholy Heat could be pretty nice. We also have Dragon Ray Channeler with only one toughness so that it dies to things like Goblin Bombardment way too easily. So, do we really need these two cards nerfed right now when we have Modern Horizons 3 in the format? I don't think so, right? I guess that idea is out of the way. So, we turn to something like a Wizards tribal. I mean, there's a good chance if Eldrazi Temple is not pre-banned, Wizards might make a slight return, but the thing about them is they're also pretty weak to Sorin decks. So the funny thing here is that because the way the historic is shaped right now with Eldrazi and Sorin decks being at the top means that even if we did have Charmaw for the red decks, it'll still be I think it'll still be Eldrazi and Sorin decks on top because red decks just can't beat the Sorin decks. Given the current top meta, I think the Eldrazi Temple is going to be a net negative for the format, and since the red aggro decks can't really beat Sorin decks, I think the top of the ladder is just going to stay the same when it comes to metagame. So that's my 2 cents with the current historic format. But the spoilers aren't all out yet, and who knows like if the rumors are wrong. Stripmine isn't even there, and Wasteland gets revealed, things like that. I haven't really played much Timeless recently because of the counterspell unban in historic. But with Edge of Eternities, things are about to change for sure, for better or worse. I think it'll be definitely fun at the start, but although I'm a bit optimistic, it might become worse. We'll see. But again, at the start, I love playing with new cards, building new decks, but it might get degenerate pretty fast, and with how little change Timeless gets, it might become still just like how it is now. But again, I'm a bit optimistic because they did say something about the anthology coming to Timeless, so we'll have to see.